The crimson sun cast long shadows over the dusty plains of Tombstone, Arizona Territory. In the autumn of 1883, as Madeline Fletcher clutched her screaming toddler to her chest, watching the stagecoach disappear into the distance. Her husband, Charles, was gone likely for good this time, leaving behind nothing but broken promises and mounting debts. The wind whipped her skirts around her ankles as she stood alone outside their small, weathered cabin on the outskirts of town, trying desperately to soothe little Emma, whose wails echoed across the barren landscape. "Hush now, sweet girl," Madeline whispered, bouncing her daughter gently. "We will manage somehow." But the tremble in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. With winter approaching, their food stores dwindling and not a penny to their name, she wasn't sure how they would survive the week, let alone the harsh months ahead. Charles had left before disappearing for days, sometimes weeks at a time, chasing the next big strike or gambling opportunity, but never like this. Never with such finality. Never taking what little money they had saved and leaving a note that simply read, "This life isn't for me. Don't wait." The pain of his abandonment was still raw, a burning ache that threatened to consume her. Inside their cabin, conditions were dire. The pantry contained only a handful of beans, some flour with weevils, and a small tin of coffee. The roof leaked in 3 places, and the window beside the front door rattled with each gust of wind. Madeline had sold her mother's silver locket the previous week just to buy milk for Emma. As darkness fell, she put Emma to bed in their single room, singing softly until the child's eyes drifted closed. Only then did Madeline allow her tears to fall silently, her slender frame shaking with each stifled sob. At 22, she found herself utterly alone in a harsh land that showed little mercy to abandoned women and children. She must have fallen asleep at the table because the pounding at the door startled her awake. Fear clutched at her heart. Visitors at night rarely brought good news in Tombstone. Grabbing the rusted revolver Charles had left behind, she approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" she called, her voice stronger than she felt. "Thomas Finley, madam. I work the Fuller Ranch north of here." The voice was deep but gentle. "I don't mean to frighten you, but I saw your light and thought you might need assistance." Madeline hesitated. She had seen Thomas Finley in town, occasionally tall and broad-shouldered with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He wasn't like the other cowboys who swaggered through Tombstone looking for trouble. Still, a woman alone couldn't be too careful. "What business brings you here at this hour, Mr. Finley?" she asked, the gun steady in her hands. There was a pause before he answered. "I passed Charles Fletcher on the eastbound stage this afternoon. Well, he didn't look to be coming back. I brought some supplies. Figured you and the little one might need them." Madeline's heart sank. So others had witnessed her husband's departure, her abandonment now public knowledge. The shame of it burned her cheeks, but hunger and practicality overrode her pride. Slowly, she unlatched the door. Thomas Finley stood on her porch, hat in hand, his weathered face illuminated by the dim light spilling from the cabin. Beside him sat a wooden crate filled with provisions: flour, beans, salt pork, and most prominently, several loaves of fresh bread that filled the night air with their tantalizing aroma. "I don't want your charity, Mr. Finley," Madeline said, though her eyes couldn't leave the food. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "It's not charity, Mrs. Fletcher, just neighborly. Out here we have to look after one another." His eyes, warm brown beneath the shadow of his hat, met hers. "We remain, Mrs. Fletcher, those of us who choose this land, who stay despite its hardships. We remain, and we help each other through." The simple sincerity of his words, "we remain," struck Madeline deeply. It stood in stark contrast to her husband's final message. This man, barely more than a stranger, was offering what Charles never had: steadfastness. "Thank you," she whispered, finally lowering the gun. "Emma and I are grateful." Thomas nodded, seemingly relieved. "There's work at the ranch, Mrs. Fletcher. Mr. Fuller's wife needs help with washing and mending. It's not much, but it would bring in some money. And, well, I could fix that roof before the winter rains come." "Why would you help us?" Madeline couldn't stop herself from asking. In her experience, men rarely offered assistance without expecting something in return. Thomas looked at her directly, his expression honest. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because no one should face the territory alone, especially not with a little one to care for." As he turned to leave, promising to return the next day to start on the roof, Madeline watched his retreating figure disappear into the darkness. For the first time since discovering Charles's note, she felt something other than despair, a tiny flicker of hope, fragile as a candle flame in the wind, but present nonetheless. The bread Thomas had brought was still warm. Madeline broke off a piece, savoring its simple nourishment. "We remain," she whispered to herself, the words somehow becoming a promise, a declaration of her own. That night she slept beside Emma, her arms wrapped protectively around her daughter. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight they had bread on the table and a cowboy's promise of help. Perhaps it would be enough to begin again. True to his word, Thomas Finley arrived the next morning as Madeline was preparing a simple breakfast for Emma. The toddler watched the tall stranger curiously from behind her mother's skirts, her thumb firmly planted in her mouth. Madeline had tied her honey-brown hair back with a faded ribbon and donned her cleanest dress, determined to face the day with whatever dignity she could muster. "Good morning, Mrs. Fletcher," Thomas called, his voice carrying across the yard. He wasn't alone. A wagon loaded with roofing materials and additional supplies stood behind him. "I hope it's not too early." "Not at all, Mr. Finley," Madeline replied, stepping onto the porch. "We've been up with the sun." She gestured to Emma, who continued to eye the visitor warily. "This is my daughter, Emma." Thomas knelt down to the child's level, his movements gentle despite his size. "Well, hello there, Miss Emma. That's quite a fine doll you have." He smiled at the ragged cloth toy clutched in the girl's small hand. Emma studied him for a long moment before offering the tiniest of smiles. "Her name is Sarah," she said quietly. "A beautiful name for a beautiful doll," Thomas replied seriously, as if conducting an important business transaction. He looked up at Madeline. "I've brought the materials for your roof and some additional provisions. Mr. Fuller sends his regards and asks if you might visit his wife this afternoon about the washing work. I'd be happy to accompany you to the ranch when I've finished here." Madeline felt a surge of gratitude mingled with wariness. "You're being exceptionally kind, Mr. Finley." "I'm not sure how I'll ever repay you." Thomas stood, brushing dust from his worn denim pants. "No repayment necessary, Mrs. Fletcher, though I wouldn't refuse a cup of coffee if you have any to spare." For the first time in days, Madeline found herself smiling. "I believe I can manage that much." As the morning progressed, she watched from the doorway as Thomas worked efficiently on the roof, replacing broken shingles and sealing leaks. Emma gradually overcame her shyness, bringing her doll outside to supervise the repairs, occasionally asking questions that Thomas answered with patient good humor. By midday, the roof was sound, and Thomas had also repaired the rattling window and the loose porch step that had been a hazard for months. Charles had always promised to fix these things but never seemed to find the time between his various schemes and adventures. Over a simple lunch of bread and beans, Thomas spoke little of himself, despite Madeline's questions. She learned he had been working at the Fuller Ranch for nearly 3 years, that he had come west from Missouri after the war, and that he had no family to speak of. He mentioned these facts without elaboration or self-pity, as if they were simply the conditions of his existence, neither good nor bad. "And you, Mrs. Fletcher?" he asked eventually. "How did you come to Tombstone?" Madeline sighed, cutting another small piece of bread for Emma. Charles had grand ideas about silver mining. He heard the stories of strikes and fortunes made overnight. "We came from St. Louis 2 years ago. I was young and foolish enough to believe in dreams." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Dreams aren't foolish by nature, Mrs. Fletcher. Just some of the dreamers." The quiet understanding in his words brought unexpected tears to Madeline's eyes. She blinked them away hurriedly, unwilling to display such vulnerability. "Well," she said briskly, "dreams don't feed a child or fix a roof, do they?" "I'm learning to be practical these days." Thomas studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "There's room for both, I think, practicality and dreams." He stood, gathering his hat. "We should head to the Fuller Ranch if you're amenable, Mrs. Fuller is expecting you, and there's a gathering storm on the horizon." The Fuller Ranch was larger than Madeline had imagined, with a sprawling main house and several outbuildings nestled in a sheltered valley about 5 miles north of Tombstone. Mrs. Fuller, a plump, energetic woman in her 50s, welcomed Madeline warmly, clucking sympathetically over Emma and immediately offering the child a cookie from a blue ceramic jar. "That Charles Fletcher was never worth the ground he walked on," Mrs. Fuller declared bluntly, once Emma was contentedly playing with a set of wooden blocks in the corner of the spacious kitchen. "You're better off without him, my dear, though I imagine it doesn't feel that way just yet." Madeline was taken aback by the woman's frankness, but found it oddly comforting after days of holding her emotions in check. "Now then," Mrs. Fuller continued, "I've more washing and mending than these old hands can manage, what with the ranch hands and the harvest crews. I can pay you fairly $2 a week to start, with meals included on the days you work. You can bring little Emma, of course. There's plenty of space for her to play safely." The offer was more generous than Madeline had dared hope. $2 weekly would allow her to begin saving, to perhaps stock her pantry for winter, and maybe even set aside a little for Emma's future. She accepted gratefully, agreeing to begin the following morning. As Thomas drove them back toward Madeline's cabin, the threatened storm was building on the horizon, dark clouds massing against the fading light. Emma had fallen asleep, lulled by the wagon's gentle rocking, her small head resting against Madeline's shoulder. "You've given me much more than bread and roof repairs today, Mr. Finley," Madeline said softly. "You've given me a chance." Thomas kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "You would have found your way, Mrs. Fletcher, with or without my interference. You have strength in you. I recognized it the moment you opened that door with a gun in your hands." Madeline laughed quietly. "I was terrified, not strong." "Being afraid and being strong aren't mutually exclusive," he replied. "In fact, I've found they often go hand in hand." The rain began just as they reached the cabin, fat drops splashing in the dust. Thomas hurried to unhitch the wagon while Madeline carried Emma inside, marveling at how the repaired roof held sound against the sudden downpour. "You should wait out the worst of it before heading back," Madeline suggested as Thomas stomped his boots on the porch. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the propriety of entering a woman's home unaccompanied. "I don't want to impose, Mrs. Fletcher." "Madeline," she said impulsively. "Please call me Madeline, and after everything you've done, you could never be an imposition." That evening, as rain drummed steadily on the newly repaired roof, they shared a simple meal. Thomas entertained her with stories of ranch life and the colorful characters of Tombstone. He spoke with quiet humor, never boastful or crude like many of the men she had encountered in town. Emma, who had awakened from her nap, watched him with increasing fascination, eventually abandoning her shyness to climb onto his lap and demand a story about horses. By the time the rain stopped and stars emerged in the cleared sky, Madeline realized she had smiled more in one evening than in the past month. As Thomas prepared to leave, she found herself reluctant to see him go. "Will I see you tomorrow?" she asked, immediately embarrassed by the eagerness in her voice. Thomas smiled, settling his hat on his head. "I have business in town, but I'll check on you both on my way back to the ranch." He paused, seeming to debate his next words. "There's a social at the church come Saturday. Music, dancing, food. The whole town attends. Perhaps you and Emma might enjoy an evening out." Was he inviting her specifically? Madeline couldn't be sure, but the possibility sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "Perhaps we would," she replied carefully. After he left, Madeline stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the starlight silver the landscape, feeling the night air cool against her skin. For the first time since Charles's departure, she allowed herself to consider a future different from the one she had resigned herself to, not just survival, but perhaps something more. "We remain," she whispered to the night, the words feeling increasingly like a promise rather than just a statement of fact. The next few days established a new rhythm for Madeline and Emma. Each morning, they would walk the 5 miles to Fuller Ranch, where Madeline would spend the day washing, ironing, and mending while Mrs. Fuller doted on Emma, teaching the toddler simple songs and letting her help with baking. The work was hard but satisfying, and the Fullers treated her with respect rather than pity. True to his word, Thomas checked on them regularly, sometimes bringing small gifts: a jar of honey, a book of children's stories for Emma, fresh eggs from the ranch chickens. His visits were brief, but became the highlights of Madeline's days. She found herself watching the trail for his approach, her heart quickening at the sight of his tall figure on horseback. By Friday, she had earned her first wages and made a trip into Tombstone to purchase necessities: lamp oil, soap, thread, and, after much deliberation, a length of blue ribbon for Emma's hair. The town was busier than usual, preparing for the Saturday social, and Madeline felt the curious eyes of townspeople following her progress along Allen Street. "Mrs. Fletcher," a voice called as she exited the general store. Madeline turned to see Martha Simmons, the minister's wife, hurrying toward her. Mrs. Simmons was a kindly woman who had always made Madeline feel welcome at church, even when Charles refused to attend. "We've missed you at services," Mrs. Simmons said, clasping Madeline's hand warmly. "And this little angel, too." She smiled at Emma, who was watching a group of children playing hopscotch nearby. "I do hope you'll join us for the social tomorrow evening. The entire community will be there: music, dancing, plenty of food. It would do you good to have some fellowship." Madeline hesitated. She had been considering Thomas's suggestion about the social, but the thought of facing the entire town, many of whom would know of Charles's abandonment, was daunting. Mrs. Simmons seemed to read her thoughts. "Now don't you worry about wagging tongues, my dear. Those worth knowing will judge you by your own character, not by the actions of a man who didn't deserve you." She squeezed Madeline's hand. "Besides, I happen to know that Thomas Finley has been asking if you might attend. Such a fine man, Thomas, solid as the day is long." Heat rushed to Madeline's cheeks. "Mr. Finley has been very kind," she managed. Mrs. Simmons's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Kind, yes, and perhaps a bit smitten if an old woman's observations count for anything. Well, I must be off, still much to prepare. I do hope we'll see you tomorrow, dear." As Madeline walked home, Her mind whirled with conflicting emotions. Was it possible that Thomas felt something more than neighborly concern? And if so, was she ready to acknowledge such feelings, with the wound of Charles's betrayal still so fresh? Emma, tired from the day's excitement, fell asleep early that evening. Madeline sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. In the quiet, she allowed herself to examine her feelings honestly. Charles had swept her off her feet when she was barely 18, dazzling her with grand promises and visions of adventure. But Thomas offered something entirely different. Not flashy declarations or improbable dreams, but steadiness, reliability, and a quiet strength that she found increasingly compelling. "We remain," she whispered to herself, the phrase that had become something of a mantra. Perhaps it was time to stop defining herself by what she had lost and start considering what might still be gained. Saturday dawned clear and mild, a perfect early autumn day. Madeline spent extra time preparing for the social, washing her hair with the precious store-bought soap, and ironing her best dress, a simple blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. She arranged Emma's dark curls with the new blue ribbon, earning a delighted giggle from the toddler who twirled to admire herself. "Pretty, Mama," Emma declared, clapping her hands. "Yes, you are," Madeline agreed, fighting a sudden swell of emotion. Her daughter deserved so much more than a life of struggle and uncertainty. Perhaps this evening, this step back into the community, was as much for Emma's future as it was for Madeline's peace of mind. They were nearly ready when a knock sounded at the door. Madeline opened it to find Thomas standing on the porch, looking uncharacteristically nervous. He had traded his work clothes for clean trousers, a pressed white shirt, and a vest. His usually untamed hair was slicked back, and he had clearly made a valiant attempt to tame his beard. "Mrs. Fletcher Madeline," he corrected himself, removing his hat. "I thought perhaps you and Emma might appreciate a ride to the social. The church is a fair distance to walk, especially for little legs." Madeline smiled, touched by his thoughtfulness. "That would be lovely, Thomas. We're almost ready." "You look beautiful," he blurted, then immediately flushed. "Both of you, that is." Emma, delighted with the compliment, executed another twirl. "I have a blue ribbon," she announced proudly. Thomas knelt to admire it properly. "The prettiest ribbon I've ever seen, on the prettiest little lady in Arizona territory." Madeline watched their interaction, a warm feeling spreading through her chest. The easy way Thomas connected with Emma, the genuine care he showed her daughter, spoke volumes about his character. The church was ablaze with lanterns when they arrived, the sound of fiddle music and laughter spilling into the evening air. Quilts had been spread on the ground for picnicking, and tables groaned under the weight of contributed dishes. Children darted between groups of adults, playing games of tag in the fading light. For a moment, Madeline faltered, intimidated by the prospect of facing so many people at once. Thomas, sensing her hesitation, offered his arm. "We'll face them together," he said quietly. "Remember, we remain." The simple phrase, now shared between them, gave her courage. Straightening her shoulders, Madeline took his arm and stepped forward into the gathering. To her relief, the reception was overwhelmingly warm. Mrs. Fuller immediately whisked Emma off to join the other children at a table of sweets, while Mrs. Simmons introduced Madeline to several women she hadn't yet met. There were sympathetic glances and a few whispered comments, but nothing like the judgment she had feared. As the evening progressed, Madeline found herself genuinely enjoying the company, the music, and the sense of belonging that had been absent for so long. She watched Thomas interact with the townspeople, noting how universally respected he seemed to be. Men nodded deferentially when he spoke, Women smiled warmly but with clear understanding that his attention was elsewhere. When the dancing began in earnest, Thomas approached her, hand extended. "Would you do me the honor, Madeline?" Her heart fluttered like a schoolgirl's. "I haven't danced in years," she admitted. "I may step on your toes." His smile was gentle. "I'll risk it." The music was lively, a reel that had couples spinning and laughing across the cleared space before the church. Thomas proved to be an unexpectedly graceful dancer, guiding Madeline confidently through the steps. When she stumbled, his strong hand steadied her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're doing wonderfully," he encouraged, and for that moment, with the music swirling around them and the stars emerging overhead, Madeline believed him. Later, as the evening mellowed and younger children began to fade, Thomas suggested a walk. Emma had fallen asleep on a quilt near Mrs. Fuller, who waved away Madeline's concern. "Let her rest, dear. You young folks enjoy the evening. We'll keep an eye on the little one." The night air was cool as they strolled away from the church, the sounds of music growing fainter behind them. Thomas was uncharacteristically quiet, seeming lost in thought. "Thank you for convincing me to come tonight," Madeline said, breaking the silence. "It was exactly what I needed." Thomas stopped walking, turning to face her in the moonlight. "Madeline, there's something I need to say, and I'm not sure how to go about it properly." Her pulse quickened. "Just say what's in your heart, Thomas." He took a deep breath. "I know it's too soon. I know you're still healing from Charles's betrayal and you have Emma to think of. But I find myself thinking of you both constantly. Your strength, your grace in the face of adversity. I admire you more than I can say." Madeline felt tears gathering in her eyes, not of sadness but of a strange, overwhelming hope. "I'm not asking for promises," Thomas continued. "Just permission, I suppose. Permission to call on you properly, to spend time with you and Emma, to see if perhaps in time you might come to feel for me what I already feel for you." The honesty of his declaration, so different from Charles's flowery, ultimately empty promises, touched her deeply. "And what do you feel, Thomas?" she asked softly. His eyes, earnest in the moonlight, held hers. "That you and Emma are the family I never dared to dream of having. That when I said we remain, I meant it with everything in me." Madeline stepped closer, placing her hand against his cheek. "I think perhaps it isn't too soon after all. Some things, some people, come into our lives exactly when we need them most." When Thomas kissed her, it was gentle and questioning, giving her every chance to pull away. But Madeline found herself responding with a surety that surprised her, as if some part of her had been waiting for precisely this moment, this man. They returned to the social hand in hand, a simple gesture that did not go unnoticed by the observant townspeople. Mrs. Simmons caught Madeline's eye and gave her an approving nod, while Mr. Fuller clapped Thomas on the shoulder with a knowing smile. That night, as Thomas drove them home under a canopy of stars, Emma still sleeping soundly in Madeline's arms, a comfortable silence stretched between them. The future, which had seemed so bleak just days before, now held possibilities that Madeline had never dared to imagine. "May I call on you tomorrow?" Thomas asked as he helped her down from the wagon at her cabin. "I would like that very much," Madeline replied, her heart lighter than it had been in years. As she settled Emma into bed and prepared for sleep herself, Madeline reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. From abandonment to the beginnings of something precious in less than a week. It seemed almost too much to believe. Yet as she drifted toward sleep, the memory of Thomas's steadfast gaze and gentle kiss convinced her that this was no dream, but rather the start of something real and enduring. "We remain," she murmured, the words now a promise for the future rather than merely an observation of the present. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm that brought increasing joy to Madeline's life. She continued her work at the Fuller Ranch, taking pride in her growing independence. Thomas called on them regularly, sometimes bringing small gifts, a carved wooden horse for Emma, wildflowers for Madeline, but more often simply offering his time and company. October gave way to November, and the Arizona Territory began to show subtle signs of the approaching winter. The days grew shorter, the nights cooler. Thomas spent many evenings at their cabin, reading stories to Emma or helping Madeline with repairs and improvements that made the small house increasingly comfortable. On Sundays, they attended church together, presenting a picture that drew approving glances from the community. Mrs. Simmons took to referring to them as our little family when speaking to others, a designation that Madeline found she did not mind at all. It was on a particularly chilly evening in late November that Thomas arrived with an unusual request. "The ranch is hosting a Thanksgiving gathering," he explained as they sat by the fire after Emma had been put to bed. "Mr. Fuller has invited his business associates from as far as Tucson, along with half the town, it seems. Mrs. Fuller is somewhat overwhelmed with the preparations and asked if you might be willing to help more extensively this week. She's offering additional wages, of course." Madeline smiled, warmed by the fire and Thomas's steady presence beside her. "Of course I'll help. Mrs. Fuller has been so kind to us." Thomas seemed hesitant, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "There's more, actually. The guests will be staying several days, and the main house will be quite full. Mrs. Fuller suggested, and I agree, that it might be more comfortable for you and Emma to stay in the small guest house near the orchard during the gathering. It would save you the daily walk and—" He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. "I thought perhaps it might give us a chance to see how we function as as a family of sorts, if that's not too presumptuous." The suggestion sent a flutter of nervous anticipation through Madeline. They had been courting properly for nearly 2 months now, their feelings growing deeper with each passing day. Still, the idea of temporarily sharing a household, even with the propriety of separate quarters within the guest house, represented a significant step. "What exactly are you asking, Thomas?" she inquired softly. He met her gaze directly. "I'm asking if you and Emma would consider staying at Fuller Ranch through Thanksgiving week. I'm asking if you'd allow me to care for you both more fully, to see if the feelings we've begun to build might flourish into something more permanent. I'm asking, in essence, if you might be willing to consider a future where we remain means something specific and binding." The fire crackled in the silence that followed his words. Madeline studied Thomas's face, finding nothing but sincerity and a vulnerability that touched her deeply. This strong, capable man was offering his heart completely, with no guarantees of its safe return. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to staying at the ranch. Yes to exploring what our future might hold. Yes, Thomas." The relief and joy that transformed his features made Madeline's heart swell. When he leaned forward to kiss her, there was a new certainty in his touch, a promise of devotion that required no words. The following Monday, Thomas arrived with the wagon to transport Madeline and Emma to Fuller Ranch for their extended stay. Emma was beside herself with excitement, chattering endlessly about horses and cows and the ranch dog she had befriended during their visits. The guest house proved to be charming, a small, well-maintained structure with 2 bedrooms, a cozy sitting area, and a kitchen. Mrs. Fuller had stocked the pantry generously and placed fresh flowers on the table, making the space immediately welcoming. "It's lovely," Madeline breathed, taking in the comfortable furnishings and the view of the orchard from the front window. Thomas smiled, pleased by her reaction. I'm staying in the bunkhouse with the other hands, but I'll be close by if you need anything at all. The week quickly became a whirlwind of activity. Thanksgiving guests began arriving on Tuesday. Bankers, cattlemen, and merchants from throughout the territory, many with wives and children in tow. Madeline worked alongside Mrs. Fuller, preparing elaborate meals, arranging accommodations, and ensuring every detail was perfect. In the evenings, exhausted but fulfilled, she would return to the guest house where Thomas often waited, ready to help with Emma's bedtime routine or simply to share quiet conversation by the fire. These domestic moments, ordinary yet profound, gave Madeline a glimpse of what a shared life might entail: the daily partnership, the divided responsibilities, the multiplied joys. Thanksgiving Day dawned clear and cold, with a crispness to the air that hinted at the winter to come. The main house buzzed with activity from early morning as final preparations were made for the feast. Madeline, dressed in her best, with Emma similarly attired in a dress Mrs. Fuller had gifted her, joined the throng of guests gathering in the expansive dining room. Thomas appeared at her side, looking handsome in clean clothes and freshly trimmed beard. "You both look beautiful," he murmured, his eyes conveying far more than his words. The meal was sumptuous: roast turkey and venison, potatoes prepared 3 ways, countless vegetables, breads, and pies. Mr. Fuller gave a lengthy blessing, expressing gratitude for prosperity, health, and community. Around the long table, faces glowed with fellowship and goodwill. As dishes were passed and conversation flowed, Madeline found herself observing the assembled company. These people, many of whom had been strangers just months ago, now formed the fabric of her new life. Mrs. Fuller, who had become almost a mother figure; Mr. Fuller, gruff but fair; the ranch hands who tipped their hats respectfully when they saw her in town; the townspeople who had welcomed her into their church and social gatherings; and Thomas, whose steady presence had transformed her world. After the meal, while the men retired to discuss business and the women gathered in the parlor, Madeline slipped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard, and the distant mountains were tinged with gold. "Penny for your thoughts," came Thomas's voice as he joined her on the porch. Madeline smiled, drawing her shawl closer against the chill. "I was just thinking how different this Thanksgiving is from what I imagined it would be a few months ago." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Life has a way of surprising us, for better or worse." "Mostly better lately," she replied, leaning slightly into his solid presence. They stood in companionable silence for a moment before Thomas spoke again. "Madeline, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." I had planned to wait until after the guests departed, but he took a deep breath. "The truth is, I don't want to wait another day." Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew a small object and held it in his closed hand. "I'm not a wealthy man. I don't have grand promises or fancy words. What I do have is a heart full of love for you and Emma, and a lifetime of hard work and devotion to offer." He opened his hand to reveal a simple gold band. "This was my mother's. She gave it to me before she passed, saying I should give it only to a woman of true worth and character." His eyes, earnest and vulnerable, met hers. "I can think of no one more worthy than you, Madeline." Tears filled her eyes as he continued. "I'm asking if you would do me the tremendous honor of becoming my wife, of allowing me to be a father to Emma, of building a life together where, no matter what comes, we remain steadfast, faithful, and united." For a moment Madeline couldn't speak, overwhelmed by emotion. Then through her tears she smiled. "Yes, Thomas, with all my heart, yes." When he slipped the ring onto her finger, it fit as if it had been made for her. Their kiss, witnessed only by the setting sun and distant mountains, sealed a promise that neither took lightly. That evening they announced their engagement to the Thanksgiving gathering. The news was met with enthusiastic approval, particularly from Mrs. Fuller, who embraced Madeline tearfully and declared that she'd known from the first that they were meant for each other. Emma, not entirely understanding the significance of the announcement but sensing the joy in the room, clapped her hands and declared, "Thomas, stay forever," causing laughter and more than a few damp eyes among the assembled guests. Later, as Madeline tucked Emma into bed in the guest house, the child asked sleepily, "Is Thomas my papa now?" The question caught Madeline by surprise. She had worried about how to explain their changing relationship to Emma, who had few memories of Charles. "Would you like that, sweetheart?" she asked carefully. Emma nodded, her dark curls bouncing against the pillow. "He brings bread and stories, and he doesn't go away like the other papa." The simple wisdom of her daughter's observation brought fresh tears to Madeline's eyes. "Yes, darling, Thomas stays. We all remain together." The weeks following Thanksgiving passed in a blur of preparations. With Christmas approaching and a wedding to plan, Madeline scarcely had a moment to herself. Yet the busyness was joyful, purposeful in a way her life had not been for a very long time. Thomas, with Mr. Fuller's blessing and assistance, purchased a small parcel of land adjacent to Fuller Ranch, 10 acres with a sturdy cabin, a barn, and enough grazing land for a modest herd. It would be their home, close enough to the main ranch for Thomas to continue his work while allowing them independence. "It's not much," he apologized as he showed Madeline the property for the first time. "But with time and work, I believe we could make it into something fine." Madeline walked through the cabin, noting its solid construction and the possibilities it held. The previous owner, an elderly widower who had decided to move east to live with his daughter, had maintained it well. There were 2 bedrooms, a large kitchen with a proper cook stove, and a sitting area with a stone fireplace. Windows looked out over rolling grassland toward distant mountains. "It's perfect," she declared, meaning it completely. "It's a place where we can build our life together." Thomas's smile was like sunrise breaking across his face. "I was hoping you'd say that. There's one more thing I want to show you." He led her outside and around to the side of the cabin, where, to her surprise, a small garden had been freshly turned and prepared for spring planting. "Mrs. Fuller mentioned you had expressed interest in growing vegetables and herbs," Thomas explained. "I thought you might like to plan what you'll plant when the weather warms." It was such a thoughtful gesture, so characteristic of the man she had grown to love, that Madeline found herself overcome once again. "You think of everything," she said, leaning into his embrace. "I think of you," he replied simply. "Of you and Emma and what will bring you happiness." They were married on Christmas Eve, 1883, in the small church in Tombstone. Snow had fallen the previous night, a rare occurrence that many took as a sign of divine blessing. The church was decorated with evergreens and red berries, candles glowing in every window. Madeline wore a dress of deep blue velvet, a gift from Mrs. Fuller, who insisted a bride should have something special. Emma, serving as flower girl, wore a matching ribbon in her curls and carried a small basket of pine cones dusted with flour to resemble snow. The ceremony was brief, but deeply meaningful. When Reverend Simmons pronounced them husband and wife, and Thomas kissed her with tenderness and restrained passion, Madeline felt a sense of rightness that transcended the occasion. This was no dramatic beginning, but rather the natural progression of what had been building between them since that first night when he had appeared at her door with bread and the simple declaration, "We remain." The celebration afterward at Fuller Ranch was joyous music and dancing, abundant food, and the warm wishes of a community that had embraced them both. Emma, delighted to be the center of attention in her pretty dress, charmed everyone with her energy and growing vocabulary. As the evening progressed, Madeline found a quiet moment with Mrs. Fuller, who had become such an important figure in her life. "I can never thank you enough," she began, but the older woman waved away her words. "Seeing you happy is thanks enough, my dear. Besides," she added with a twinkle in her eye, "it was clear from the moment Thomas first mentioned you that his heart was already engaged. All Edward and I did was provide a little encouragement." Madeline laughed, remembering Thomas's chance appearances at the ranch when she was working and the convenient errands that seemed to throw them together. "Well, your encouragement has resulted in more happiness than I ever thought possible." Mrs. Fuller patted her hand affectionately. "You deserve every bit of it, both of you. Now go find that handsome husband of yours. I believe he's being cornered by old Mr. Patterson about cattle breeding techniques, and he could use rescuing." Their first night as husband and wife was spent in their new cabin, which Thomas had prepared with characteristic thoughtfulness. A fire blazed in the hearth, warming the main room where Emma quickly fell asleep on a small trundle bed that Thomas had crafted himself. They would move her to her own room once she was fully settled in the new space. Alone at last, with their daughter sleeping peacefully and the sounds of the winter night surrounding them, Madeline and Thomas found themselves suddenly shy with each other. They had maintained propriety throughout their courtship, their physical expressions limited to kisses and embraces. Thomas took her hands, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "I want you to know that nothing need happen tonight if you're not ready, Madeline. We have a lifetime ahead of us." His consideration, his willingness to put her comfort above his own desires, only deepened her love for him. "I am ready," she said softly. "I've been ready since the moment you said we remain." Their coming together was tender and reverent, each discovery a joy, each vulnerability a gift freely given and received with gratitude. In Thomas's arms, Madeline found healing for old wounds and promise for new beginnings. When they finally slept, it was deeply and peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they had truly found home in each other. Winter gave way to spring, and with the changing season came new growth not just in the garden Madeline had planted, but in their family's bonds. Emma, who had initially called Thomas by name, gradually began referring to him as Papa, a transition that brought tears to his eyes the first time it happened. Thomas proved to be an exceptional father, patient and encouraging with Emma's boundless curiosity. He taught her to identify bird calls, to help with simple chores, and to ride her very own pony, a gentle old mare named Daisy that he purchased specifically for her. Madeline watched their relationship flourish with a full heart. The contrast between Thomas's steady presence and Charles's erratic, ultimately abandoned fatherhood could not have been more stark. Emma blossomed under Thomas's care, growing more confident and secure with each passing day. Their life settled into a pattern that combined hard work with simple pleasures. Thomas continued his duties at Fuller Ranch while also developing their own property. Madeline maintained a few washing clients in town, but focused primarily on their home and garden, which yielded a bounty of vegetables that kept their table well supplied and provided extra to preserve for winter. They became known in Tombstone for their hospitality, often hosting Sunday dinners for friends and neighbors. Thomas, who had once been somewhat solitary, revealed a talent for storytelling that entertained their guests, while Madeline's cooking drew praise from even the most accomplished homemakers in the territory. As summer approached, bringing with it intense heat and occasional spectacular thunderstorms, Madeline began to suspect that their family might be expanding. The familiar signs morning sickness, fatigue, certain cravings confirmed what her heart already knew. By June, she was certain enough to share the news with Thomas. She chose a quiet evening when Emma had been put to bed, and they were sitting on the porch watching lightning flicker on the distant horizon. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, the scent of dust and sage carried on the intermittent breeze. "I have something to tell you," Madeline said, her hand finding his in the gathering darkness. Thomas turned to her, his expression curious. "Is everything all right?" She smiled, squeezing his fingers gently. "Everything is wonderful. Thomas, we're going to have a baby. Sometime in early winter, I think." For a moment, he seemed unable to process her words. Then his face transformed with such joy that Madeline felt her heart might burst with love for this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." He knelt before her, placing his hands reverently on her still flat abdomen. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "Your mama and I can't wait to meet you." Looking up at Madeline, his eyes shining with unshed tears, he added, "Thank you for this gift, for our family, for choosing to remain with me." As the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, they moved inside, their arms around each other, plans and dreams for their growing family spilling forth in excited whispers. That night, as they lay together listening to the storm rage and subside, Madeline reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. Just a year ago, she had stood watching Charles disappear on the eastbound stage, believing her life was effectively over. Now, she lay in the arms of a man whose love was as steady as the land itself, with one child sleeping peacefully down the hall and another growing beneath her heart. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and early fall. Emma was delighted with the news that she would be a big sister, chattering endlessly to Madeline's growing belly and making plans for all the things she would teach the baby. As Madeline's time drew near, the community rallied around them in the way of frontier towns. Women brought meals and baby clothes, shared advice and birthing stories. Mrs. Fuller insisted on hiring extra help at the main ranch to allow Thomas more time at home as the birth approached. November brought an early cold snap, with frost glittering on the desert plants and smoke rising from chimneys throughout Tombstone. Madeline, now in her final weeks, found herself nesting intensely, organizing and reorganizing the baby's corner of their bedroom, knitting tiny garments and preparing their home for the coming winter. Thomas was attentive to her every need, finishing his work at the ranch as quickly as possible each day to return to her side. He built a cradle from pine, sanded smooth and polished to a soft glow. At night, he read to Emma while Madeline rested, his deep voice carrying through the cabin in soothing cadences. The baby arrived on a clear, cold morning in early December, after a night of labor during which Thomas had remained steadfastly by Madeline's side, holding her hand through each contraction, wiping her brow and murmuring encouragement. Mrs. Fuller and the town midwife attended the birth, their experienced hands guiding the baby safely into the world, a boy. The midwife announced as the infant's lusty cry filled the room. "A fine, strong boy." Thomas, who had been supporting Madeline's shoulders, made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "A son," he whispered against her damp hair. "Madeline, we have a son." When the baby was placed in her arms, cleaned and wrapped in a soft blanket, Madeline felt a surge of love so powerful it took her breath away. The tiny face, red and wrinkled, bore a distinct resemblance to Thomas in the shape of his nose and chin. "He's perfect," she breathed, counting fingers and toes, marveling at the miniature perfection of his features. Thomas sat beside her on the bed, his arm around her shoulders, his eyes never leaving their son's face. "What shall we name him?" he asked. They had discussed names but hadn't settled on any definite choices, preferring to wait until they met their child. Madeline considered for a moment. "Samuel," she suggested. "It means heard by God." "Because I believe God heard my prayers when I was at my most desperate, and He sent you to our door with bread and hope." Thomas nodded, clearly moved by her reasoning. "Samuel it is. Samuel Thomas Finley." Mrs. Fuller, who had been tidying the room, paused to smile at them. "A fine name for a fine boy. And speaking of young ones, I believe there's a certain little girl who's been waiting very impatiently to meet her brother." Emma, who had been staying with the Fullers during the birth, was brought in by Mr. Fuller. She approached the bed cautiously, her eyes wide with wonder at the tiny bundle in her mother's arms. "Emma," Madeline said gently, "come meet your brother Samuel." With Thomas's help, Emma climbed carefully onto the bed, peering at the baby with intense curiosity. "He's very small," she observed. "And red," Thomas chuckled. "Yes, he is, but he'll grow quickly, and before you know it, he'll be following you everywhere." Emma seemed to consider this, her expression serious. Then she leaned forward and placed a gentle kiss on Samuel's forehead. "Hello, Samuel. I'm your sister, and I'm going to teach you everything." As Madeline watched her daughter and son, with Thomas's strong arm supporting them all, she felt a completeness that transcended words. Their family, forged in hardship but flourishing in love, had expanded to embrace this new life. It was everything she had once believed impossible. The Finley family flourished in the years that followed Samuel's birth. Their little homestead expanded gradually, a larger barn to accommodate Thomas's growing herd. Additional rooms added to the cabin as their family continued to grow. A proper fence around Madeline's garden, which became famous throughout the territory for its productivity. 2 years after Samuel came Catherine, a delicate beauty with her mother's honey-brown hair and her father's steady temperament. Then, 3 years later, twins Michael and Matthew arrived, their dual birth a challenge that the whole community helped them weather. Emma grew into a capable, confident young woman, adored by her younger siblings and respected in Tombstone for her intelligence and kind heart. At 18, she began teaching at the town school, riding Daisy, now quite elderly but still gentle, to and from their homestead each day. Samuel, so like his father in appearance and manner, showed a natural aptitude for ranching. By 12, he was Thomas's shadow, learning every aspect of cattle raising and land management, his quiet competence earning the respect of the Fuller ranch hands. Catherine, dreamy and artistic, filled sketchbooks with drawings of the desert landscape and its inhabitants, her talent remarkable for one so young. The twins, inseparable and mischievous, brought constant laughter and occasional exasperation to the household with their adventures. Through it all, the foundation remained the love between Madeline and Thomas, steady, enduring, and ever deepening. They weathered the inevitable challenges of frontier life together. Drought years when the cattle suffered and finances were tight, the winter when scarlet fever swept through Tombstone, touching their family but, thankfully, taking none of them, the fire that destroyed their barn but spared their home. Each trial seemed to strengthen rather than diminish their bond. Each challenge met with the same steadfast determination, expressed in those simple words that had become their family motto: "We remain." On a golden autumn evening in 1898, 15 years after Thomas had first appeared at Madeline's door with bread and hope, they sat together on the porch of their now substantial home, watching the sunset paint the desert in familiar glory. Their children were scattered, Emma staying late at the schoolhouse, to prepare for the next day's lessons. Samuel helping with the fall roundup at Fuller Ranch, Catherine sketching by the creek, and the twins reluctantly completing their chores in the barn. Thomas took Madeline's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture as familiar as breathing. "Do you ever think about how differently our lives might have turned out?" he asked reflectively. Madeline leaned against his shoulder, still finding the same comfort in his solid presence that she had all those years ago. "Sometimes," she admitted, "if Charles hadn't left, if you hadn't come that night." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "I've never told you this, but I almost didn't. Come to your door that night, I mean. I saw Charles board that stage, saw the way he didn't look back, and I knew what it meant. I thought about you alone with Emma, and I wanted to help, but I wasn't sure it was my place. What changed your mind?" Madeline asked, curious about this detail from their shared history that she had never heard before. Thomas smiled, a hint of his younger self visible in the expression. "Mrs. Fuller, actually. I mentioned seeing Charles leave and my concern for you both. She boxed my ears, figuratively speaking, and told me that a man who sees a need and does nothing about it is no man at all. Then she sent me off with that loaf of bread and strict instructions not to return without assuring your welfare." Madeline laughed, picturing the scene. "So I have Mrs. Fuller to thank for our happiness." "In part," Thomas agreed. "But mostly, I think, we have ourselves to thank. We chose each other, Madeline. We chose to remain, to build, to trust. Every day we keep making that choice." As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, Madeline reflected on the wisdom of his words. Life offered no guarantees. They had seen enough joy and sorrow in their community to know that truth intimately. But in choosing to face whatever came together, in committing to remain steadfast through all seasons, they had created something beautiful and enduring. From the barn came the sound of the twins' laughter. From the creek, the faint humming of Catherine's favorite hymn. In the distance, a rider approached Samuel returning from his day's work, his silhouette against the darkening sky so like his father's that it brought a smile to Madeline's lips. "We remain," she whispered, the words still carrying their full weight of promise and gratitude after all these years. Thomas's hand tightened around hers, his silent affirmation of their shared journey and the path that stretched before them, still unfolding, still rich with possibility. As night settled fully over the land they had made their own, the Finley family gathered for dinner in their warm, well-lit home. Voices overlapped in conversation. Laughter punctuated the meal, and Madeline, looking around the table at these beloved faces, felt the fullness of a life well lived. From that desperate day when she had stood alone with her toddler after a forlorn farewell, to this moment of abundant family joy, the journey had been unexpected but ultimately blessed. The cowboy who had come with bread and said, "We remain," had given her not just sustenance for a day but a foundation for a lifetime. And they remained together, their love a constant in a changing world, their family a testament to the enduring power of compassion, commitment, and the courage to begin again.